Thank you, British Dyslexia Association and Positive Dyslexia, for inviting me to give this presentation on phonics and learning to read. Critically important, but with limitations. I think this presentation is well timed in view of recent government policy that systematic synthetic phonics should be mandatory and indeed the teaching methodology of choice. Let me begin by talking about the structure of this presentation. We're going to begin, first of all, by looking at two definitions of phonics, before I go on to exploring the evidence that phonics does indeed facilitate progress in learning to read. I'm then going to describe the early foundation skills for acquiring phonic knowledge, specifically phonological awareness, letter knowledge, and oral language, especially vocabulary. We'll then consider, are there different types of phonics before looking at what a systematic phonic-based program should look like. The second half of the talk will be taken up by addressing the limitations of the use of phonics in a complex orthography like English. I'm going to ask the question, do we need to go beyond phonics to ensure children take advantage of all available strategies for learning to read and spell? I'm going to look at how we should supplement phonics programs within the context of reading by a methodology called two-process modelling and top-down processing that exploits children's vocabulary knowledge and context cues in text, before finishing by looking at larger sublexical units within spelling, such as orthographic units, onsets and rhymes, and morphemes. Let's look at some definitions of phonics. I've chosen two layman definitions of phonics. The first comes from the Oxford Dictionary. Phonics is described as a method of teaching people to read by correlating sounds with symbols in an alphabetic writing system such as English. A rather more detailed definition of phonics comes from Wikipedia. Phonics is a method for teaching people how to read and write in an alphabetic orthography. It is done by demonstrating the relationship between the sounds of the spoken language and the letters or groups of letters or syllables of the written language. Phonics forms part of the national literacy strategy and has done so for many years. A recent government publication advocates synthetic phonics as the key method of teaching reading to children. However, phonics has had a rather checkered history over the years. In the 1940s and 50s, phonics was taught mainly by a rather repetitive skill and drill method. This met up with many criticisms, and so in the 1960s through to the 1980s, there was a shift from traditional drill and skill phonics to whole language and whole word approaches. These met with little success, so over the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a shift back to phonics, but in a rather different way to the skill and drill approach. Rather, we use phonics in a much more flexible way these days. We incorporate phonics within a much broader language-related methodology that includes not just learning to read at the word level, but also reading comprehension. What is the evidence that phonics works? We know from some large-scale meta-analyses that have been conducted mainly in the US that systematic phonics results in better reading and spelling outcomes than non-phonics or non-systematic phonics. Now, meta-analyses is where you draw together a large number of studies of phonics, which include very large samples of children, so that you can increase the statistical power. And these studies have clearly shown that if children are subjected to a systematic phonics program, that improves their outcome in learning to read and spell, and that these systematic phonic programs are much superior to non-phonics, such as homework teaching, or non-systematic phonics. I'm going to describe in a little while what we mean by systematic phonics. Now, the effect size or impact of phonics intervention is increased when it's delivered within the context of a broad literacy curriculum that includes not just learning about phoneme to graphic correspondences, but also includes oral language and comprehension work. Phonics should not be delivered in a skill and drill repetitive format. That's a common and indeed justified criticism of phonics. Let's look now at what the foundation skills needed for children to benefit from phonics instruction. I'm going to base this on a longitudinal study that I carried out myself with Margaret Snowling and Charles Hume a number of years ago. We were able to demonstrate in this longitudinal study of typically developing 4 to 7-year-olds that there are 3 important early foundation skills that must be in place for the child to acquire what we term the alphabetic principle. Now, the alphabetic principle was first raised by Brian Byrne in a series of experimental studies that he carried out in the 1990s. Now, what the alphabetic principle means is that when a child hears the sound S in a spoken word, she is able to associate it with and realize that it's represented by the printed letter S at the beginning of the word sat. This seems a very obvious connection, but it's critical in establishing phonics skill, and it forms the foundation upon which all subsequent literacy skill is developed. So what are the 3 foundation skills needed to establish this important alphabetic principle? First, the child needs a minimum level of phonological or speech sound awareness that enables her to split spoken words into their constituent sounds. The second foundation skill is the child's acquisition of alphabetic letter knowledge. And finally, the child needs to link or map the individual sound onto its representative written form or letter. Phonological awareness is in itself driven by early progress in spoken language, especially vocabulary. Let me show how these key foundation skills relate to reading in the form of this path diagram. Now, a path diagram is a visual representation of how reading progresses over time, and it works from left through to right. So the left side, we're looking at the children at age 4, then we follow up the same group of children a year later at age 5, and we see them for the last time at age 6. Now, when the children in our study were age 4, they were given a verbal IQ test that did include a vocabulary test. They were followed up a year later, and we're looking now at 3 variables. We're looking at phonological awareness or phonemes, the child's sensitivity to the sound structure of spoken words. We're looking at alphabetic letter knowledge, their ease of learning the 26 letters of the alphabet. And I've also introduced a third domain here called letter knowledge times phonemes. Now, this is a statistical product term that we calculated by multiplying the children's letter knowledge scores with their phonological awareness scores. And it's meant to represent the linkage or mapping of sounds onto letters. Now, we know that verbal IQ, particularly vocabulary knowledge, has a significant relationship with phonological knowledge a year later, and that's exemplified by that arrow that goes from left to right that indicates a statistically significant relationship. Now we're going to look at the relationship between variables at age 5, letter knowledge times phonemes, letter knowledge and phonemes, and their relationship to phonic reading a year later at age 6, when the children were given tests of word level reading and nonsense word reading that measures decoding ability. And we can see that there are significant pathways between letter knowledge and phonic reading, letter knowledge times phonemes and phonic reading, and phonemes and phonic readings. So we've shown there the 4 foundation skills: verbal IQ that drives phonological awareness, letter knowledge times phonemes, and these together have an impact on children's ease in learning how to phonically decode. Now, our study of the foundation skills of reading led us to develop a special workbook designed for children aged 4 to 7 years who have difficulty learning to read. And these are children who typically come from families where there's a high risk of reading problems, or children who have developmental speech and language delay. So we developed this workbook for use by parents and teachers, which emphasizes the importance of these 4 foundation skills. So within my special alphabet book, published recently by Jessica Kingsley, we cover oral language, including vocabulary. We, through an alphabet story, teach the children about alphabetic letters. We include lots of phonological awareness training exercises and also linkage activities. Now, let's look now at different types of phonic instruction. The traditional form of phonic instruction is analytic phonics. Now, this starts with whole words, so the child establishes a sight word vocabulary to begin with. They are then taught the initial sounds at a very slow rate of 1 letter sound per week, and the child is encouraged to pronounce the word before sounding it out. So when she's shown the printed word cat, she says cat and then goes cat. Synthetic phonics is rather different because it begins before sight word development. The letter sounds are introduced at a rapid rate of 6 every 8 days, and sounding out and blending precede word pronunciation. So when the child is shown the printed word cat, she says cat. Programs such as Jolly Phonics are synthetic schemes. Now, which type of phonics should we use? There are a series of studies carried out by Rhoda Johnson and her colleagues in Scotland, which actually led to the government prescribing synthetic phonics as the method of choice when teaching children to read. Now, in the Johnson studies, they claim to show that there were greater improvements in reading after 10 weeks instruction in synthetic phonics when compared to analytic phonics. So what they did is they took a sample of boys who were late readers and they allocated them to one of 2 groups. One group of boys had synthetic instruction over 10 weeks and the other group had analytic phonics. And they claimed that the children who had exposure to synthetic phonics did better on their later post-intervention reading tests than the children who had analytic phonics. And on the basis of the Johnson studies, synthetic phonics was recommended by the government as the prescriptive teaching method of choice. However, the Johnson studies have been met with quite heavy criticism. One criticism was that the children in the different groups were taught different amounts. But of course, if you're going to compare 2 different teaching methodologies, they do need to have the same amounts of instruction. Another criticism was that the authors of the study did both the teaching and the testing. In other words, the testers who assessed the children at the end of the intervention were not blind to group allocation. They knew in which group each child belonged, which could, of course, mean tester bias is a possibility. And finally, the groups did not receive the same content of instruction in terms of the words learned. So they were taught different words. And again, it's very difficult to compare the children's performance when you're using different sets of words across the 2 groups. Professor Usha Goswami has suggested that the type of phonic program that is used may be far less important than the method of delivering it. And she suggests that, importantly, the method of delivery should be systematic. What do we mean by systematic phonics? I'm going to answer this question by drawing on the findings of the government-commissioned Rose Report, which was published in 2009. Now, according to the Rose Report, for a phonic program to be systematic, it should first of all be phonological and phonic-based. It needs to incorporate phonological sound-based training alongside work on phonic decoding. It needs, secondly, to be multisensory, so that the child uses all the sensory input channels for learning, meaning that they should listen to the sounds in the words, see the printed letters, and also feel the word by writing it. Structured phonics should be cumulative. It should be built on a small base and expand on pre-existing knowledge. And it should be sequential and progressive, which means that it should be a structured order of presentation, with the child starting with simple alphabetic sound to letter relationships and then moving through to more complex graphemes such as diphthongs and digraphs, and then eventually towards larger sublexical units such as morphemes or units of meaning. It's important that we adopt small steps, that it needs to be slow, it needs to be a little bit at a time to ensure success. And it should be logical, so phonological training should precede phonic instruction, because phonic decoding is built on a foundation base of good phonological awareness. There should be a strong emphasis on overlearning through repetition, so the child is able to build strong associations or mappings between sounds and letters. And finally, there should be a strong emphasis on building self-esteem through the experience of success. Now, I've tried to argue a strong case for phonics so far, but I do want to draw people's attention to the fact that there are limitations to phonics, especially in a complex orthography like English. And these limitations to phonics, and indeed criticisms of phonics, were a key feature of a number of papers that were presented at the recent British Dyslexia Association 2021 conference. One of the presenters, Dr. Jarman, asked the question, do we overemphasize the importance of phonics in teaching reading? He made the point that many children, especially dyslexic learners, get stuck in a phonics strategies that can then become a default mode that is difficult to shift. In other words, once they've learned how to phonically decode, they try and sound out every single word they encounter, which is slow and laborious and can be at the expense of comprehension. McMurray and Carew suggest that synthetic phonics on its own is insufficient for many dyslexic children, and it fails to promote the development of orthographic or morphemic knowledge, which is essential to spelling accuracy. They point out that dyslexics need explicit instruction to develop orthographic knowledge in a language like English that is not phonologically transparent. So how do we get around this phonics limitation? Jarman, McMurray et al. At the conference argued that phonics should not be the only method of teaching literacy, particularly in respect of spelling. Now, it's their view that orthographic and morphemic knowledge should be taught alongside phonics from the very beginning of primary school, not left until much later on, as it tends to be at the moment. And they say that this is essential because children need to be able to simultaneously process phonemic, morphemic, and orthographic units in order to be good at spelling in particular. Now, Jarman described an approach to teaching that is called POM, P-O-M, and this teaching approach integrates from the very beginning of primary school, learning about phonemes, units of sound, orthographic units such as onsets and rhymes, and morphemes or units of meaning. Now, onset and rhymes mean that a child takes a single syllable word, the onset is the beginning consonant or consonant cluster, and the rhyme is the following on vowel and any end consonants. Now, what they were able to demonstrate in a study of 10 to 11-year-old dyslexics, that if this POM approach was used in an integrated way over 20 reading lessons, it resulted in an increase of 2 standard deviation score points, which is a 1.6 ratio gain in the children's reading scores after they've been delivered the program, which is a very impressive finding. So I'd like to look at alternatives, or rather supplementary approaches to phonics, first in relation to reading. We're going to look, first of all, at a particular methodology that was developed by Robert Savage and his colleagues at UCL, and which was published in a journal in 2018. Now, they're talking about a 2-process model of learning to read, which combines synthetic phonics with what they term set for variability instruction, which helps adjust pronunciation. English is a complex orthography because there's a lot of variation between sound to letter relationships, so we don't always pronounce a given sound in the same way. We don't have clear one-to-one sound to letter correspondence, so we need a method of adjusting pronunciation, and this is where the set for variability comes in. So let me explain how this approach works. Let's assume the child is confronted by the written word dozing. The child is first instructed to apply a synthetic phonics strategy. So the child says do-o-zing, dozing. They then ask themselves, is this a word I know? On evaluation, they can see through this metacognitive strategy that it isn't a word that actually exists. So the child is then encouraged to replace the existing vowel sound O with its alternative pronunciation, which is O, and they then resynthesize the new string. So it becomes ozing, dozing, and they ask themselves finally, is this a real word? Yes, it is. So what these authors then did was to carry out a randomized control intervention trial. And they were able to show that this model had a definite advantage for later reading, spelling, and sentence comprehension compared to a synthetic phonics strategy alone. I want to consider another supplement to phonics, which is based on a model of top-down processing. This is a language-based compensatory aid when phonic decoding fails. Now, what we mean by top-down processing, it's a term used to describe how verbally able children with dyslexia are able to use their good semantic knowledge, in particular their vocabulary, alongside context and content clues that are available in text. And this enables them to supplement their poor decoding ability. So what the child is encouraged to do is to partially decode a word as far as they can, and then to use their vocabulary knowledge and the available context and context clues in text to guide them towards the correct reading of the word. So let's take the example of the complex spelling of the word yacht. Now, even severely dyslexic children can usually partially decode a presented word. They can typically identify the initial and final letter. So the child might say yacht, but then they come to realize, actually, this is a story about boating. So they can use the clues in the text, the content, the context, the position of the word in the sentence. They know the word begins with a y and ends with a t. It's about boating, so it's highly probable that the word must be yacht. Now, top-down processing is a potentially trainable strategy in verbally able poor decoders, for whom synthetic phonics often fails. The child is told, decode the word as far as you can, and then use the words you already know and what the story is about to arrive at the best possible estimate or guess at what the word says. And this can produce a big difference to verbally able children who have dyslexia. Let's go beyond reading now and look at supplementing phonics within the more difficult and demanding literacy-based subject of spelling. Now, orthographic units means learning about larger sublexical units within words, such as morphemes and onset rhyme word families. Now, research has shown us that there's far greater spelling regularity in larger sublexical units such as these than amongst phonemes and graphemes, which constitute basic phonics. So what we need to do, we need to exploit this consistency by teaching it, for instance, the onset rhyme boundary through the adoption of analogical or word families approaches. Now, this approach to teaching is very much based on the elegant studies that were carried out by Usha Goswami and her colleagues in the 1990s. And they were able to demonstrate that if children were taught analogous spellings or word families, it improved their spelling capabilities. So a good example of a word family would be might, fight, light, and sight. Obviously, the onset or beginning consonant varies from word to word, but they all display the same rhyme, IGHT, which is very consistently spelled in many English words. Now, one point to note is that breaking words into larger sublexical units reduces the load on the child's short-term verbal working memory, which we know is usually compromised in many dyslexic children. Obviously, if you're breaking up a word at the onset rhyme boundary, all the child has to do is memorize and blend 2 units. Whereas if they're breaking words into the phoneme, grapheme, correspondence route that's dictated by phonics, they may have to memorize or blend 4 or 5 units, which puts a considerable load on their short-term verbal memory. Another quite promising approach to using larger sublexical units is that described as words within words, which is a teaching methodology developed by Brooks and Weeks. Now, this is a methodology in which the child is encouraged to build up compound multisyllabic words from simple words that are already contained in their spelling lexicon. So we can take a compound word like carpet, and the child comes to realize that it's actually composed of two simple spellings of words that they already know, car and pet. And other examples would be with, stand, over, came. I want to conclude by looking at the use of morphemes in relation to spelling. Now, morphemic awareness and spelling exploits the morphophonological basis of English orthography. Our English orthography is based partly on units of sounds or phonemes and partly on units of meaning, our morphemes. Now, we know that many apparently irregular spellings retain their morphemic origins or roots at the expense of phonemes. So let's take the word healthy. We would expect to spell this phonically as H-E-L-T-H-Y. But in fact, it's spelled H-E-A-L-T-H-Y because it's retaining its morphemic root, which is the word heal, that is spelled H-E-A-L. Another example of a morphemic structure within a word is an inflection ending like ed, which denotes past tense. And children use the ed ending consistently to describe past tense from around the age of 10 years. Now, the researchers who've done most of the work on morphemic awareness and spelling are Peter Bryant and Teresina Nunes. One of the first studies they did was a longitudinal study that showed that children's awareness of grammatical structures within words predicts later use of morphological regularities like ed endings in primary age spellers. They were also able to show that training in morphological units improves spelling, especially of compound words. So one of the studies they did was with a group of 7 to 8-year-old poor spellers. And what they did is they divided these poor spellers and allocated them into two separate intervention groups. The first group were taught spelling in the context of a phonics program, while the second group was taught morphological regularities in relation to spelling, such as the ed ending. And they also had a control group who just had standard spelling instruction. And what they found was at the end of the intervention study, the children who had the phonic-based approach to spelling and the children who had the morphological approach to spelling performed far better on spelling tests than those who were in the control group. But there were no differences between the two experimental groups. It seemed to Nunes and Bryant that children needed both approaches. They needed to learn how to spell phonically, but they also needed to learn how to use morphological units as well. So the final aspect I want to look at in relation to morphemic instruction relates to rule-based learning in the context of morphemes and spelling. This is nicely demonstrated in a randomized control trial that was carried out by Nunes and Bryant, in which they were concentrating on two particular morphemes, IAN and ION, that appear at the end of words and use the schwa vowel pronunciation up. Now, what they did is they took a sample of poor spellers and they allocated the poor spellers to one of three groups. Now, the first group was described as an explicit training group. These were children who were not only presented with large numbers of spellings that contained the IAN and ION endings, but they were also taught the actual rule to apply them. They were told that if it's a person, such as a magician, you spell it IAN. If it is an abstract construct, you use the ION ending, as in construction or adaptation. The implicit group had lots of exposure to spellings with IAN and ION endings, but they weren't taught the actual rule, which dictated which to be used. IAN for people, ION for abstract constructs. And there was a control group that just had standard spelling instruction. Now, what these authors found was that it was the children in the explicit training group who'd been taught the rule. They did far better than the other two groups on a post-intervention spelling test. So children can acquire spelling rules through learning about morphemic regularities. And this effect was demonstrated in both the lab and classroom-based studies. Interestingly, Increasing children's morpheme awareness additionally improves their vocabulary knowledge, as shown by a study by Julia Carroll. It seems that making children aware of morphemes draws their attention to the structure of words and helps them appreciate that words can be built up by combining the different morphemes, not just core words like the word to heal, but also adding prefixes and suffixes to create compound or multisensory words. People wanting to explore the use of morphemes and spelling will be well advised to have a look at the excellent book by Nunes and Bryant, Improving Literacy by Teaching Morphemes. So I'd like to just summarize the takeaway messages from this presentation. First, I think I've demonstrated that phonic knowledge is essential to the child's acquisition of the alphabetic principle, her understanding that sounds and letters are systematically related to each other. And it is this which forms the basis upon which all subsequent literacy development depends. Second, I've demonstrated that phonic knowledge is built up from the important early foundation skills of oral language, especially vocabulary, phonological speech sound awareness, and alphabetic letter knowledge acquisition. We've seen that phonics has been demonstrated to be highly effective in helping children learn to read, but it must be structured, systematic, and importantly, it needs to be integrated into broader language and literacy teaching schemes. In the second half of this presentation, we've looked at the fact that phonics has its limitations in a complex morphophonological orthography like English. What we need to do ideally is to supplement the teaching of phonics, whatever form that phonics teaching takes, by integrating it with teaching approaches that emphasize larger sublexical units within words, like concepts and rhymes and morphemes, and metacognitive processes, such as the set for variability instruction and taking advantage of context, which enables children to adjust their pronunciation. And we need to incorporate phonics with these supplementary teaching approaches from the very beginning of learning to read. If people want to follow up more on the use of phonics and its relation to reading, I can recommend my own book, Understanding and Supporting Children with Literacy Difficulties, an Evidence-Based Guide for Practitioners, which was published by Jessica Kingsley earlier this year, and the particularly relevant chapters are 2 and 7. Thank you very much.